I woke up at 5 in the morning to the sound of snow pelting my bedroom window, and my first thought was that I needed to get the snowblower out before the accumulation made it impossible to leave my driveway. By the time I pulled on my boots and winter coat, there were already 8 inches on the ground, and the weather report on my phone showed no signs of letting up until at least noon. I lived in Briarwood Heights, a planned community outside of Rochester, Minnesota, where the HOA had rules about everything from mailbox colors to the exact height your grass could reach before you got fined. I had moved here 6 months ago after my divorce, thinking a fresh start in a quiet neighborhood would be good for me. The house was nice, the neighbors seemed decent, and I figured I could handle a few petty rules if it meant living somewhere peaceful. That morning, as I wheeled my Husqvarna snowblower out of the garage, I had no idea I was about to violate one of those petty rules in a way that would spiral into absolute chaos. The machine roared to life, cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a chainsaw through butter. It was loud, sure, but it was a snowblower. They were supposed to be loud. I had cleared maybe half my driveway when I saw her marching across the street in a pink bathrobe and duck boots, her blonde hair in curlers, her face twisted into an expression of pure rage. Karen Mitchell was the HOA president, a position she treated like she was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company rather than a busybody in charge of a subdivision with 43 houses. She was in her early 50s, divorced twice according to neighborhood gossip, and had nothing better to do than enforce every single rule in the HOA handbook with the enthusiasm of a medieval inquisitor. "Excuse me," she shrieked over the sound of the snowblower. "Excuse me, sir." I killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt oppressive. "Can I help you? You have any idea what time it is?" She had her phone out, showing me the screen like it was evidence in a murder trial. "It is 5:23 in the morning, and you are operating heavy machinery in violation of community noise ordinances." I blinked at her. Snow was still falling, already starting to fill in the path I had just cleared. "Madam, I need to get to work. If I don't clear this now, I won't be able to get my car out. The noise ordinance clearly states that no power equipment may be operated before 7 a.m. on weekdays and 8 a.m. on weekends." She was scrolling through her phone now, pulling up what I assumed was a digital copy of the HOA rules. "You are in direct violation of Section 12, subsection B." "It's snowing," I said, gesturing at the sky like she might have missed the weather. "People need to clear their driveways." "Then you should have set your alarm for 7 a.m. like everyone else." She crossed her arms, somehow managing to look authoritative despite the curlers. "I'm giving you a formal warning. If you continue, I'll have no choice but to issue a fine." I wanted to argue, but I also wanted to keep my job, and my boss was not the understanding type when it came to tardiness. "Fine. I'll wait until 7. She nodded, satisfied, and marched back across the street to her house, leaving tracks in the fresh snow. I stood there in my driveway, watching the snow pile up, and seriously reconsidered every life choice that had led me to this moment. At exactly 7 a.m., I fired up the snowblower again. By then, there were 12 inches on the ground, and what should have been a 20-minute job took nearly an hour. I was late to work anyway, and my boss made a point of commenting on it during our morning meeting. I didn't mention the HOA because I knew how it would sound. Nobody outside of an HOA-controlled neighborhood could understand the absurdity of it. That evening when I got home, there was a notice taped to my front door. It was printed on official Briarwood Heights letterhead, complete with a little logo of a house surrounded by trees. The letter informed me that I had been issued a formal citation for violating the community noise ordinance, and that I was required to attend a hearing at the next HOA board meeting in 2 weeks. I crumpled the letter and tossed it on my kitchen counter, too exhausted to deal with it. This was my life now, apparently. Fighting with middle-aged women about when I was allowed to clear snow from my own property. Over the next week, it snowed 3 more times. Each time, I waited until exactly 7 a.m. to start my snowblower, and each time, I saw Karen watching me from her front window, phone in hand, probably recording me to make sure I wasn't starting even a minute early. The other neighbors started giving me sympathetic looks when I saw them at the mailbox or the grocery store. Apparently, everyone had their own Karen stories, their own petty citations and absurd fines. She fined me $200 because my Christmas lights were the wrong shade of white. My next-door neighbor, an older man named Dale, told me one evening while we were both shoveling our sidewalks. Said they were too blue-toned and didn't match the community aesthetic. "That's insane," I said. "That's Karen," Dale replied with a shrug. "Best advice I can give you is just keep your head down and don't give her any ammunition. She lives for this stuff." But keeping my head down wasn't an option when the next HOA board meeting rolled around. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland rectangular building at the front of the neighborhood that mostly got used for voting during elections and the occasional yoga class. I walked in at exactly 6:30 p.m., as specified in my citation, and found about 15 other people already seated in folding chairs facing a long table where Karen and 4 other board members sat. Karen was dressed like she was about to give a TED talk, in a navy blazer and pearls, her hair done up in stiff curls. The other board members looked significantly less enthusiastic. There was Greg, a retired accountant who always seemed half asleep, Linda, a woman in her 60s who ran the neighborhood book club, Tom, who owned a landscaping business and mostly seemed annoyed to be there, and Susan, the secretary, who was furiously typing notes on a laptop. "Let's call this meeting to order," Karen said, banging a gavel on the table like she was a judge. "First order of business, we have a violation hearing for Mr. William Osborne of 247 Maple Drive." That was me. I stood up, feeling like I was on trial for a crime I didn't commit. "Mr. Osborne, you are cited for operating a snowblower before the allowed time on December 2nd. How do you plead?" "How do I plead?" I repeated, unable to keep the disbelief out of my voice. "This isn't a court. We operate under Robert's Rules of Order," Karen said primly. "Now, do you dispute the citation?" "Yes, I dispute it. It was snowing. I needed to clear my driveway to get to work." "The weather is not an excuse for violating community standards," Karen said. She pulled out a printed photograph which she passed down the table to the other board members. "I have photographic evidence that Mr. Osborne was operating his equipment at 5:23 a.m., a full 97 minutes before the allowed time." Greg squinted at the photo, holding it at arm's length like he needed reading glasses. "Looks like a guy with a snowblower." "Exactly," Karen said triumphantly. "I don't see what the big deal is," Tom said, leaning back in his chair. "The guy needed to clear his driveway. It was a blizzard." "The rules exist for a reason," Karen snapped. "If we allow one person to violate them, it opens the door for everyone to do whatever they want. Chaos." Linda raised her hand timidly. "Maybe we could consider revising the snow removal policy. It does seem a bit rigid." "We are not here to revise policy. We are here to enforce it." Karen turned back to me, her expression cold. "Mr. Osborne, the board finds you in violation. You are hereby fined $150, payable within 30 days. "This is ridiculous," I said, my voice rising. "You're fining me for clearing snow from my own driveway." You are being fined for violating the noise ordinance, Karen corrected. If you wish to appeal, you may submit a written request, which will be reviewed at next month's meeting. I walked out of that community center angrier than I had been in years. $150 for using a snowblower. I went home, poured myself a generous glass of whiskey, and seriously considered putting my house on the market. But I didn't. Partly because selling a house was a hassle, and partly because I'm stubborn. I paid the fine, but I also started reading through the HOA bylaws with the kind of attention usually reserved for legal contracts. If Karen wanted to play games, I could play games too. 2 weeks later, we got hit with the biggest snowstorm Minnesota had seen in a decade. The Weather Service was calling it a historic event, with predictions of over 2 feet of snow and wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour. The storm started on a Thursday evening and didn't let up until Saturday afternoon. By the time it was over, the entire neighborhood was buried. I waited until exactly 7 a.m. on Saturday to start clearing my driveway. The snow was so deep that the snowblower struggled, and I had to go over some sections 3 or 4 times to cut through it all. It took me nearly 3 hours to clear my driveway and the sidewalk in front of my house, as required by city ordinance. When I finally finished and put the snowblower back in my garage, I was exhausted, frozen, and ready for a hot shower and a nap. That's when I noticed Karen's car was still buried in her driveway across the street. Actually, most of the driveways on the street were still buried. Apparently, not everyone owned a snowblower or had the energy to spend 3 hours in sub-zero temperatures digging themselves out. I was in the middle of that hot shower when my doorbell rang. Then it rang again, and again. I wrapped a towel around my waist and went dripping to the front door, yanking it open to find Karen standing there, for once not looking angry. She looked worried. "I need to borrow your snowblower," she said without preamble. I stared at her. "Excuse me. The roads are impassable. The city hasn't plowed us yet, and we have an emergency situation. Mrs. Henderson at the end of the street has run out of her medication and needs to get to the pharmacy. I need to clear enough of the road so she can drive out." "Why don't you use your own snowblower?" I asked. "I don't have one. I usually hire a service, but they're completely booked because of the storm." I leaned against the doorframe, taking a moment to appreciate the irony. "Let me get this straight. You fined me for using my snowblower too early, and now you want to borrow it." "This is an emergency," Karen said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. "Mrs. Henderson is 87 years old. She needs her heart medication." "Call 911, I said. "They can send an ambulance." I did. They said they are overwhelmed with calls and it could be hours before they can get here. I looked past her at the street, buried under 2 feet of snow. Even if an ambulance could make it into the neighborhood, which was doubtful, it would take forever. And Mrs. Henderson was a nice old lady who always waved when she saw me. I didn't want her to suffer because of my grudge against Karen. "Fine," I said. "Give me 5 minutes to get dressed." I threw on dry clothes and grabbed the keys to my garage. Karen followed me across the street to where my snowblower sat, looking ridiculously relieved. "Thank you so much," she said. "I really appreciate this." "I'm not doing it for you," I said, starting up the machine. "I'm doing it for Mrs. Henderson." It took me another 2 hours to clear a path down Maple Drive to the main road. The snowblower was meant for driveways, not streets, and I had to go over the same sections repeatedly to get anything close to a drivable path. By the time I finished, my hands were numb even inside my gloves, and I was pretty sure I had frostbite on my nose. Karen met me at my house when I returned, looking almost friendly. "You did a wonderful thing today, William. The community really appreciates it." "Great," I said, putting the snowblower back in my garage. "Now we're even. You leave me alone and I'll leave you alone." "Actually," Karen said, and I knew immediately I wasn't going to like whatever came next. "The board had an emergency meeting and we'd like to hire you as the community snow removal contractor for the rest of the winter." I laughed. Actually laughed. "You're joking." "I'm completely serious. We'll pay you $500 per storm to clear all the streets in Briarwood Heights. After you fine me for using my snowblower." "No thanks. We'll waive the fine," Karen said quickly. "And we'll revise the noise ordinance to allow for snow removal at any hour during active snowfall." I studied her face, trying to figure out the angle. Karen didn't do anything unless it benefited her somehow. "What's the catch?" "No catch. We genuinely need someone reliable, and you have the equipment and clearly the work ethic." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What do you say?" $500 per storm was actually decent money, especially considering we were only in early December and had at least 3 more months of winter ahead. And having the fine waived would be nice. Plus, if the noise ordinance got revised, that was a win for everyone in the neighborhood. "I want it in writing," I said. "Contract, revised ordinance, everything. Of course. I'll have Susan draw up the paperwork and email it to you by Monday." I should have known better. I should have remembered that Karen didn't operate in good faith, that everything she did was designed to give her more power and control. But I was tired, cold, and frankly, the money was tempting. So I agreed. The contract arrived Monday evening, and I read through it carefully before signing. Everything seemed above board. The noise ordinance revision was included, the payment terms were clear, and there was even a clause about the HOA providing fuel reimbursement. I signed it, scanned it, and sent it back. The first storm after that came on a Wednesday night, dumping another 18 inches. I spent all day Thursday clearing the streets, starting at 6 a.m. and not finishing until well after dark. It was exhausting work, but when I submitted my invoice to the HOA, Karen approved it within 24 hours and I had the money in my account by the weekend. The second storm hit the following Tuesday. Same routine. Clear all the streets, submit the invoice, get paid. By the third storm, I had developed an efficient system. I knew which streets to clear first, where the snow tended to drift, and how to position the discharge chute to avoid burying anyone's mailbox. Everything was going smoothly until January, when the storms started coming back to back. We got hit with 3 major storms in 10 days, and I was out there constantly, clearing snow until my shoulders ached and my hands were permanently raw from the cold. But I was making good money, and for the first time since moving to Briarwood Heights, I felt like I was actually part of the community. People waved when they saw me. A few folks even left thermoses of hot coffee on their porches for me to grab while I worked. Then came the storm that changed everything. The Weather Service had been tracking it for days, calling it a potential blizzard with snowfall totals that could exceed 30 inches. The city issued a warning for people to stay off the roads, and schools and businesses closed preemptively. I spent the day before the storm preparing. I changed the oil in my snowblower, made sure I had spare shear pins and fuel, and stocked up on food and supplies. When the snow started falling Thursday evening, I settled in to wait it out. By Friday morning, we had 20 inches on the ground and it was still coming down hard. The wind was brutal, creating drifts that were waist-high in some places. I knew I needed to wait for the storm to pass before I could even attempt to clear anything, so I spent the day watching movies and monitoring the weather reports. The storm finally tapered off Friday night. Saturday morning, I headed out at dawn to assess the damage. It was worse than I expected. The snow was so deep that I could barely open my front door. My driveway had drifts that were over 4 feet tall, and the streets looked like the surface of some frozen alien planet. I started with my own driveway, which took nearly 4 hours. Then I tackled Maple Drive, the main street through the neighborhood. The snowblower was struggling. This was more snow than it was really designed to handle, and I had to take it slow, making multiple passes and stopping frequently to let the machine cool down. I was about halfway down Maple Drive when I heard something pop inside the snowblower, followed by a grinding noise that made my teeth ache. I killed the engine and checked the auger, which appeared to be jammed. After 20 minutes of digging around in the machine with frozen fingers, I found the problem. A shear pin had broken, which was an easy fix, but when I tried to replace it, I discovered that the shaft itself was bent. This was not good. A bent shaft meant the snowblower was essentially dead until I could get it to a repair shop, and given the storm, that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. I was standing there in the middle of the street, trying to figure out what to do when my phone rang. It was Karen. "William, how is the snow removal coming?" "Not great," I said. "My snowblower just broke down." There was a pause. "What do you mean, broke down?" "I mean the shaft is bent and it won't run. I need to get it repaired before I can finish clearing the streets." "That's unacceptable," Karen said, her voice sharp. "You have a contract, I'm aware, but I can't clear snow with a broken machine." "Then rent one, buy one, I don't care. The streets need to be cleared today." I looked down at my snowblower, then out at the street, which was still buried under 2 feet of snow. "Karen, every rental place in a 100-mile radius is going to be cleaned out, and even if I could find one, it would cost more than you're paying me for this job." "That sounds like your problem, not mine," Karen said. "If you don't fulfill your contract obligations, the HOA will be forced to take action." "What kind of action?" "Legal action," she said coolly. "Breach of contract. We could sue you for damages and the cost of hiring another contractor." I felt a surge of anger so intense it actually warmed me up. "You're threatening to sue me because my equipment broke down during a historic blizzard. I'm informing you of the consequences of failing to meet your contractual obligations. I expect the streets to be cleared by end of day tomorrow." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in the middle of Maple Drive, phone in hand, and seriously considered just walking away from the whole thing. Let Karen and her HOA figure it out themselves. But I also knew she was petty enough to actually sue me, and while I doubted she'd win, the hassle and legal fees alone would be a nightmare. I spent the next hour calling every rental place I could find. As predicted, they were all cleaned out. Finally, in desperation, I called a dealer in Rochester that I'd bought equipment from in the past. The owner, a guy named Mike, answered on the 4th ring. "Mike, it's William Osborne. I need a snowblower, biggest one you've got, today." Mike laughed. "You and everyone else in Minnesota." "I'm sold out, buddy. Won't have new stock for at least 2 weeks. I'll pay double, triple. I'm desperate here." There was a pause. "How desperate?" "I've got an HOA threatening to sue me if I don't clear my neighborhood by tomorrow." "Let me guess. Briarwood Heights, Karen Mitchell." "How did you know?" "She called me yesterday trying to get me to send someone out there. I told her we were booked solid for the next month, and she threatened to report me to the Better Business Bureau." Mike chuckled. "That woman's a piece of work. Tell you what, I've got a commercial-grade machine in my shop that I use for demos. It's a beast, probably overkill for what you need, but it'll get the job done. I can let you borrow it for a couple days while I fix yours." "Mike, you're a lifesaver." "Yeah, well, I know what it's like dealing with HOAs. Come pick it up whenever you're ready." I drove to Rochester through streets that were barely passable, sliding through intersections and passing at least a dozen cars that had been abandoned in snow drifts. The drive normally took 20 minutes. It took me almost an hour. The snowblower Mike loaned me was indeed a beast. It was a commercial-grade machine with a 42-inch clearing width and an engine that sounded like a small car. I had to rent a trailer to haul it home, which added another expense to this increasingly expensive day. By the time I got back to Briarwood Heights and unloaded the machine, it was already getting dark. I was exhausted, frustrated, and seriously questioning why I had ever agreed to this contract. But I fired up the commercial snowblower and got to work. The machine cut through the snow like it was nothing. What had taken me hours with my personal snowblower took maybe 30 minutes per street. I worked through the night, clearing one street after another, the roar of the engine echoing through the silent neighborhood. It was close to 3 a.m. when I finally finished. Every street in Briarwood Heights was clear. My hands were numb, my back was screaming, and I was pretty sure I was hypothermic. But the job was done. I parked the snowblower in my garage and dragged myself inside, not even bothering to take off my boots before collapsing on the couch. I was asleep in seconds. I woke up Saturday afternoon to my phone ringing. It was Karen again. "The streets look wonderful," she said, in a tone that suggested she was doing me a favor by acknowledging my work. "However, we've received several complaints about noise disturbance last night." I sat up, my entire body protesting. "You told me to clear the streets by end of day." "Yes, but that doesn't mean you can violate the noise ordinance. Several residents reported hearing your equipment after midnight." "Karen, I was clearing snow." "You know, the thing you threatened to sue me over if I didn't do. That's not my problem. The noise ordinance is clear. No power equipment after 10 p.m. The revised noise ordinance says snow removal can be done at any hour during active snowfall. The snowfall had stopped by 10 p.m., Karen said primly. "You were in violation. The board is issuing you a citation." I was too tired for this. "Fine. Whatever. Send me the citation." Actually, given the severity and duration of the violation, the board has voted to temporarily confiscate your equipment until the matter can be resolved at next month's meeting. That woke me up. "You're taking my snowblower." It's a standard enforcement action for repeat violations. "I was working for the HOA. You can't confiscate my equipment while I'm in the middle of fulfilling a contract for you." "The contract doesn't exempt you from community regulations," Karen said. "Tom will be by later today to collect the equipment. Please have it ready." She hung up. I stared at my phone, absolutely floored. This had to be illegal. It had to be. You couldn't just take someone's property because they violated an HOA rule. But when I called a lawyer friend of mine later that afternoon, he told me that HOAs actually had pretty broad authority to enforce their rules, including the right to confiscate property in some cases. It varied by state and by the specific bylaws of the HOA. He'd need to read through the Briarwood Heights bylaws to give me a definitive answer, which would take time I didn't have, at 5 p.m. Tom showed up at my door with a trailer. He looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry about this, William. I voted against it, for what it's worth." "Then don't take it," I said. "I have to. Karen's got pictures, documentation, the whole 9 yards. If I don't follow through, she'll have me removed from the board." He sighed. "Just bring it to next month's meeting and appeal. I'm sure the board will vote to return it." I wanted to argue, to physically prevent him from taking the snowblower. But I also knew that wouldn't help anything. So I watched as Tom loaded both my broken personal snowblower and Mike's commercial machine onto his trailer and drove away. I called Mike immediately to explain what happened. He was not happy. "They can't just take my equipment," he said. That's theft. According to my lawyer friend, they technically can if it's an enforcement action under their bylaws. That's the biggest load of BS I've ever heard. Mike was quiet for a moment. I want that machine back by Wednesday. I've got a contract job that needs it. I'll do everything I can, I promised. Monday morning, I called an emergency meeting with the HOA board. Karen refused. I called every board member individually. Greg didn't answer. Linda said she'd talk to Karen. Tom said his hands were tied. Susan gave me Karen's email and suggested I file a formal complaint. I filed the formal complaint, laying out in excruciating detail how I had been working under contract for the HOA when Karen told me to complete the snow removal immediately, which necessitated working through the night. I pointed out the contradiction in her demands and the absurdity of confiscating equipment while I was still under contract to use that equipment. Karen's response came back within an hour. Your complaint has been received and will be addressed at the February board meeting. In the meantime, the equipment confiscation stands. That's when the next storm hit. This one wasn't as bad as the previous one, only about 10 inches, but it was enough that the streets needed clearing. I didn't have my snowblower. I didn't have access to any equipment. And I was still technically under contract to clear the snow. Karen called Tuesday morning, the day after the storm. The streets need to be cleared. I don't have my snowblower, I said. You took it, remember? That's not relevant to your contractual obligations. It's completely relevant. I can't clear snow without equipment. Then rent something, hire someone, figure it out. I hung up on her. I was done playing games. By Wednesday, the streets were still buried and people were getting upset. Not at me, surprisingly, at Karen. I started getting calls and texts from neighbors asking what was going on, why the streets weren't cleared. When I explained that the HOA had confiscated my equipment, word spread fast. By Thursday, there was a petition going around to remove Karen from the board. By Friday, half the neighborhood had signed it. Karen called an emergency meeting for Saturday evening. I showed up with Mike, who had driven in from Rochester and was ready to retrieve his equipment by any means necessary. The community center was packed. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. I had never seen this many people at an HOA meeting. The energy in the room was tense. Karen banged her gavel. This emergency meeting is called to address the ongoing snow removal situation. The situation is you took my snowblower for doing exactly what you told me to do, I said from the back of the room. There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd. You violated the noise ordinance, Karen said, but she looked nervous. This was not the controlled environment she was used to. Because you told me to clear the streets immediately. My voice echoed in the small room. You threatened to sue me if I didn't finish by end of day, and then you confiscated my equipment when I did exactly that. The ordinance is clear, Karen started. The ordinance is ridiculous, someone shouted. I turned and saw it was Dale, my neighbor. We've all been dealing with these stupid rules for years and we're sick of it. The room erupted. People started shouting about their own fines, their own ridiculous citations. Someone mentioned the Christmas lights. Someone else brought up a fine they'd gotten for having the wrong shade of window shutters. Tom stood up from the board table. I move that we immediately return all confiscated equipment to Mr. Osborne and issue a formal apology. Seconded, Linda said quickly. We don't have quorum for a vote, Karen said desperately. We absolutely do, Susan said, looking up from her laptop. All board members are present and we have more than the required number of community members. I call the vote. All in favor, Tom said. 4 hands went up. Every board member except Karen. Motion passes, Susan said, typing rapidly. The equipment will be returned immediately. Karen looked like she wanted to argue, but the room was hostile and she knew it. Fine. Tom, please arrange for the equipment to be returned tomorrow. It'll be returned tonight, Tom said firmly. I'll bring it myself. Mike leaned over and whispered, Is it always like this? Apparently, I whispered back. The meeting devolved from there. People started bringing up other grievances, other rules they wanted changed. Karen tried to maintain control, but she had lost the room. Finally, someone formally moved to have her removed as president. The vote was overwhelmingly in favor. Karen stood up, her face red, her hands shaking. You people are making a huge mistake. Without proper leadership, this community will fall apart. The community will be fine, Linda said quietly. We'll be better than fine, actually. Karen grabbed her things and stormed out. The room was silent for a moment, and then someone started clapping. Soon everyone was applauding, and I realized they were looking at me. Tom called another vote and nominated Linda as the new president. It passed unanimously. Linda's first act was to form a committee to review and revise the HOA bylaws, with a focus on making the rules more reasonable and less punitive. Tom brought my equipment back that night, along with Mike's commercial snowblower. He also brought a check for $1,000. Hazard pay, he explained. For putting up with all of Karen's nonsense, it's the least we can do. Mike got his snowblower back undamaged, though he made me promise never to involve him in HOA drama again. He fixed my personal machine within a week and gave me a discount on the parts as an apology for the headache. The following week, I was out clearing my driveway after another small storm when I saw a moving truck across the street. Karen was leaving. I felt a small surge of satisfaction watching her boxes get loaded into the truck. Dale wandered over, coffee mug in hand. Heard she's moving to Florida, some retirement community with an even stricter HOA. Sounds like she'll fit right in, I said. Probably. Dale took a sip of his coffee. Hey, thanks for standing up to her. We all should have done it years ago. I just wanted to clear my driveway, I said, but the truth was, it felt good. Not just beating Karen, but watching the community come together and take back control from someone who had been abusing her power for years. The new board, with Linda as president, was like night and day. They revised the noise ordinance to be actually reasonable, allowing for snow removal and emergency repairs at any hour. They reduced most of the fines to warnings for first-time offenses. They even got rid of the stupid rule about Christmas light colors. I kept my contract as the snow removal specialist for the rest of the winter, though Linda raised my rate to $750 per storm, and added a clause that the HOA would cover equipment repairs and rental costs if my personal machine broke down. We got hit with 5 more decent storms before spring, and each time the job went smoothly. In March, as the snow finally started melting and the neighborhood slowly emerged from winter, the HOA threw a community appreciation event. It was held in the community center, the same place where Karen had tried so hard to maintain her iron grip on the neighborhood. There was food, music, and a general feeling of relief that winter was over. Linda pulled me aside during the event. I wanted to thank you again for everything. You really changed this community for the better. I just wanted to use my snowblower, I said, which got a laugh. Well, your snowblower started a revolution. She handed me an envelope. The board wanted you to have this. Inside was a gift card to a local restaurant and a handwritten note signed by all the board members and about 30 other residents, thanking me for my service to the community. I'm not going to lie, it felt good. For the first time since my divorce, since moving to this neighborhood, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I had neighbors who knew my name, who waved when they saw me, who appreciated what I did. The following winter, we had an unusually mild season with only a handful of small storms. I still had my contract with the HOA, but I barely needed to use it. The few times it did snow, I cleared the streets quickly and efficiently, and people left notes of thanks on my door. Dale and I became good friends. We started having weekly dinners, just two divorced guys in their 40s figuring out this whole single life thing. Through him, I met more people in the neighborhood, got invited to barbecues and game nights, became a real part of the community. Linda turned out to be an excellent HOA president. She was fair, reasonable, and actually listened to people's concerns. The neighborhood felt different under her leadership, more like an actual community and less like a police state. Karen's house sold in April to a young couple with a baby. They were nice people, friendly and normal. The husband, Jason, asked me about the HOA when he was moving in, clearly nervous about what he was getting into. "It's fine," I told him honestly. "They're reasonable. Just follow the basic rules and you'll be fine." "That's a relief," Jason said. "We almost didn't buy here because of the reviews online. Everyone said the HOA was a nightmare." "It used to be," I admitted, "but it's under new management now." He looked relieved and I felt oddly proud. The neighborhood I lived in wasn't perfect, but it was a hell of a lot better than it had been a year ago. In late May, I got a letter in the mail from a law firm in Florida. My stomach dropped when I saw the return address, assuming it was Karen coming after me somehow. But when I opened it, I found something completely unexpected. It was a cease and desist letter, claiming that I had defamed Karen Mitchell by spreading false information about her conduct as HOA president. It cited specific instances, including the Snowblower confiscation, and demanded that I issue a public apology and pay $10,000 in damages. I called my lawyer friend immediately. He read through the letter and started laughing. "This is garbage," he said. "Everything you said about her is documented in HOA meeting minutes. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. She doesn't have a case. So I just ignore it. I'll respond professionally telling them to pound sand, but yeah, basically ignore it. This is just Karen being Karen, trying to scare you into giving her money." He sent a response letter outlining exactly why Karen's case had no merit, and I never heard from that law firm again. But it was a good reminder that some people never change. Karen was in Florida, presumably terrorizing some new community, and she was still bitter enough about what happened in Briarwood Heights to try one last petty act of revenge. By the time the next winter rolled around, I had bought a brand new commercial-grade snowblower with some of the money I'd made the previous season. This time, when the first storm hit in November, I was ready. I cleared the streets efficiently and without drama. People thanked me. The HOA paid me promptly. It was almost boring in how smoothly everything went. One evening in December, I was having dinner with Dale when he brought up Karen out of nowhere. "Did you hear what happened to her in Florida?" he asked. "No, and I'm not sure I want to." She joined the HOA board of her new community within 2 months of moving there. Apparently, she tried to implement all kinds of new rules, including one about pool usage hours. Of course she did. Yeah, well, Florida retirees don't mess around. They voted her off the board at the next meeting, and there's talk of her getting kicked out of the community entirely for harassment. I couldn't help but laugh. So she learned nothing. "People like that never do," Dale said. "They just move from place to place, making everyone miserable until they run out of places to go." We toasted to that, grateful that Karen was someone else's problem now. The thing about living in an HOA-controlled community is that it can be great or terrible depending entirely on who's in charge. With reasonable people running the show, The HOA maintained property values, organized community events, and handled the boring administrative stuff that made the neighborhood function. With someone like Karen in charge, it became a totalitarian nightmare where you couldn't clear snow from your own driveway without risking a fine. I was lucky. I had landed in Briarwood Heights during the Karen era, but I had also been there for the transition to something better. And in a weird way, the whole snowblower incident had been a blessing. It had forced the community to confront how bad things had gotten and to make a change. The following spring, during the annual HOA meeting, Linda announced she would be stepping down as president due to health issues. She nominated Tom to replace her, and he accepted. During his acceptance speech, Tom mentioned the snowblower incident. A year and a half ago, this community almost tore itself apart over snow removal, he said. We had a president who cared more about enforcing rules than about the people those rules were supposed to serve. William Osborne stood up to that, and in doing so, he reminded all of us that we're supposed to be a community, not a dictatorship. I promise that as long as I'm president, we'll never forget that lesson. There was applause and people turned to look at me. I felt my face get hot, but I also felt proud. I had moved to Briarwood Heights looking for a fresh start, and I had found it, just not in the way I expected. That summer, the neighborhood had a block party. It was huge, with food trucks, a live band, and activities for kids. Tom made a speech thanking everyone who had volunteered over the past year, including me. He presented me with a plaque that read Briarwood Heights Snow Removal Specialist with the dates of my service. You can't get rid of me that easily, I joked. I'm contracted for next winter too. Oh, we know, Tom said with a grin. We're just hoping next winter is as boring as possible. It wasn't. Minnesota winters are never boring, but when the storms came, I was ready. I cleared the streets, people thanked me, the HOA paid me, and life went on. The drama was over. Karen was gone. The neighborhood had found its equilibrium. One night in February, after clearing the streets following a particularly heavy storm, I sat in my living room with a cup of hot chocolate and thought about how much had changed since that first morning when Karen had marched across the street in her bathrobe to yell at me about noise violations. I had gained friends, become part of a community, and helped change an entire neighborhood for the better. All because of a snowblower and a stubborn refusal to be pushed around by a petty tyrant. My phone buzzed with a text from Dale. Great job on the streets tonight. Beer tomorrow. I smiled and typed back. Sounds good. This was home now. Not just the house, but the whole neighborhood. These were my people, my community. And if another Karen ever showed up and tried to take that away, well, I still had my snowblower and I wasn't afraid to use it. The irony of the whole situation never quite left me. Karen had seized my snowblower for noise violations, then begged me to clear the roads when the big storm hit. She had threatened to sue me for not doing a job I couldn't do without equipment she had confiscated. She had created the perfect storm of bureaucratic absurdity, and it had ultimately been her downfall. In a way, I should thank her. If she hadn't been so unreasonable, so petty, so drunk on the tiny amount of power the HOA presidency gave her, I might have just been another anonymous resident of Briarwood Heights. Instead, I had become part of something bigger, part of a community that had learned to stand up for itself. The following year, Tom asked me to join the HOA board as the maintenance coordinator. It was a volunteer position, mostly focused on organizing community improvement projects and managing contractor relationships. I accepted, figuring I had enough experience dealing with HOA insanity to help prevent it from happening again. My first project was creating a new snow removal policy that made sense. We set reasonable noise restrictions with clear exceptions for emergency situations and weather events. We established a fund to help elderly or disabled residents who couldn't clear their own driveways. We created a list of approved contractors with fair, transparent pricing. It was boring, administrative work, but it mattered. Every policy we wrote, every rule we revised, was one less opportunity for another Karen to abuse power and make people's lives miserable. 3 years after the snowblower incident, I was at the hardware store buying salt for my walkway when I ran into Greg, the formerly sleepy board member from Karen's regime. He had left the board after Linda took over, claiming he was too old and tired for the drama. "William," he said, genuinely happy to see me. "How are things at the HOA?" "Good. Boring mostly, which is exactly how it should be," he laughed. "You know, I was on that board for 12 years under 3 different presidents, and Karen was by far the worst. I voted with her on that snowblower thing because I was tired of fighting with her about everything. I'm sorry about that." "It worked out," I said. "It did, didn't it?" Greg looked thoughtful. "You know what the difference was? You fought back. Everyone else just paid the fines and grumbled. You actually stood up and said no, and it changed everything." I had never thought of it that way, but he was right. All those other residents who had been fined for Christmas lights or window shutters or grass that was a 1/4 inch too tall, they had just accepted it as the price of living in an HOA community. I hadn't. Maybe because I was new and didn't know any better, or maybe because the snowblower thing was so egregiously absurd that it finally crossed the line from petty to actionable. Either way, it had worked. The neighborhood was better. The HOA was functional without being oppressive. And I had found a place where I belonged. On the 5-year anniversary of moving to Briarwood Heights, I hosted a barbecue at my house. Dale came, of course, along with Tom and Linda, who had recovered from her health scare and was doing well. Jason, the guy who had bought Karen's old house, brought his family. About 30 people showed up total, filling my backyard with conversation and laughter. At one point, Tom clinked a bottle against his beer to get everyone's attention. "I want to make a toast," he announced. 5 years ago, William moved to Briarwood Heights and immediately got into a fight with the worst HOA president in the neighborhood's history over a snowblower. That fight changed this community for the better. So here's to William, to snowblowers, and to standing up to petty tyrants wherever we find them. Everyone raised their glasses and cheered. I felt embarrassed and proud in equal measure. Later that evening, as people were leaving and I was cleaning up paper plates and empty bottles, Dale stayed behind to help. "You know," he said, "when you first moved in, I thought you were just another guy who would pay his fines and keep his head down like the rest of us. I'm glad I was wrong." "I'm glad I didn't know any better," I said. "Sometimes that's what it takes. Someone who doesn't know they're supposed to just accept it." We finished cleaning up in comfortable silence. 2 friends who had bonded over shared frustration with bureaucratic nonsense and had come out the other side better for it. That winter was particularly brutal, with storm after storm pounding Minnesota. I cleared the streets so many times I lost count. My snowblower, the one that had started everything, finally died in March after years of heavy use. I replaced it with an even better model and kept the old one in my garage as a reminder. Sometimes, when I was out clearing snow at 6 in the morning, I would think about that first day when Karen had stormed across the street to yell at me. How angry I had been. How absurd the whole situation had seemed. How I never could have predicted that her petty enforcement of a stupid rule would ultimately lead to her removal and a complete overhaul of the neighborhood's governance. Life is funny that way. The things that seem like disasters in the moment can turn out to be exactly what needed to happen. If Karen hadn't been so unreasonable about the noise ordinance, I never would have gotten involved with the HOA. If she hadn't confiscated my snowblower, the neighborhood never would have risen up against her. If she hadn't pushed things to the breaking point, nothing would have changed. So in a weird way, I'm grateful to Karen Mitchell. She taught me that sometimes you have to stand up and fight, even when it seems pointless. She showed me that communities can change if enough people care. And she gave me a story I'll be telling for the rest of my life about the time an HOA seized my snowblower for noise violations and then begged me to clear their roads. The snowblower is still in my garage, ready for the next storm. The HOA is still functional and reasonable under Tom's leadership. And I'm still here in Briarwood Heights, part of a community that learned the hard way that rules without reason are just tyranny with paperwork. Every time it snows, I smile a little bit. Because I know that somewhere in Florida, Karen is probably terrorizing some retirement community over pool hours or shuffleboard etiquette. And I know that here in Minnesota, we're doing just fine without her. The roads are clear, the neighbors are happy, and my snowblower runs at whatever hour I damn well please.